Mauritania is one of the emptiest countries on Earth. It covers more than 1 million square kilometers, twice the size of France. Fewer than 5.5 million people live in it. Half of 1% of the land can grow anything at all. It shares a border with 4 countries. It has a rail connection to none of them. It has one railway, and that railway has one purpose. Every day, that single line moves one of the largest machines human beings have ever assembled. Up to 3 kilometers from end to end, more than 200 wagons, around 22,000 tons of iron ore in a single train, dragged 704 kilometers across open Sahara, from a mountain in the north down to the Atlantic. Neither of those facts is an exaggeration. The emptiness is real. Away from the river in the south, the rain barely comes. There are stretches of the interior with no permanent settlement of any kind. You can drive for 4 hours and pass nothing that has a name. And the train is real. Roughly 14 million tons of ore run down that line every year. In some years, it has paid for close to 1/5 of the national budget. Take it away, and there is no modern Mauritanian economy left standing. There is one more thing. Anyone can ride it. There is no ticket. There is no seat. There is a single small passenger car at the back, and it is almost always full. So people climb the ladders welded to the side of the ore wagons, drop down onto the rock, and cross the desert sitting on the cargo. For nothing. In the open. Through a night that falls close to freezing. A country with almost no infrastructure operates one of the heaviest trains on the planet. And the heaviest train on the planet doubles as the local bus. Both of those things are true at the same time. Neither one explains the other. So the question is not how the train works. That part is engineering, and we will get to it. The question is what kind of country ends up living this way. This is Mauritania, the western shoulder of the Sahara, where the desert runs out of land and hits the Atlantic. North of it, Western Sahara. East, Mali. South, Senegal, and the only permanent river the country has. West, 1,200 kilometers of coast that Mauritanians spent most of their history choosing not to look at. For most of the last 1,000 years, this was not a nation. It was a corridor. Salt moved south. Gold moved north. Scholars, pilgrims, captives, and news moved with them at the speed of a camel. The railway follows almost none of those old roads. It was surveyed in the 1950s and drawn toward one object, a mountain in the far north called Chinguetti, 915 meters, the highest ground in the country, and blue-black rather than brown, because a great deal of it is magnetite. There is so much iron inside it that compasses stop working on its slopes. Needles drift. Bearings become suggestions. Keep that mountain in mind. Everything on this line comes back to it. The people riding on the ore are not, for the most part, doing it for the story. Some are traders, with sacks of dried fish going inland, or dates and goats coming out. A man might make that round trip 3 times a week for 13 years and think nothing of it. Some are mine workers going home. Some are students. Some are families with children asleep against the wagon wall, wrapped to the eyes against the dust. The alternative is a road. Some of it is good. Much of it is sand, and sand does not care about your schedule. The train breaks down too, but the train is free, and the train is going where it went yesterday. Still, nobody sits on a pile of ore for 700 kilometers because it saves them money. There is a harder reason underneath that. It takes the whole length of this country to explain properly. Out on the flat ground, the train crosses. In the hours when the surface temperature climbs past 60 degrees, something moves. The Saharan silver ant. It is small enough to sit on a fingernail, and it forages at the worst moment of the day. Not the cool of the morning, noon, on ground hot enough to kill it in minutes. That is the point. The lizards that hunt it cannot tolerate the heat. So the ant waits for the temperature to turn lethal to everything else and then goes to work. It survives out there a few minutes at a time. Its body is covered in triangular hairs that reflect sunlight and radiate heat back out. It runs at close to a meter a second on legs that hold it clear of the surface, and it memorizes the way home because there is no time to search for it. The ants collect the bodies of insects that did not solve the problem. The heat is not their enemy. The heat is the reason they are still here. Almost everything that lives in this country works on the same principle. Not endurance for its own sake, a calculation about what can be borne and for how long. 704 kilometers southwest of the Iron Mountain, the line ends. Nouadhibou sits on a thin finger of land pointing south into the Atlantic, bay on one side, open ocean on the other. It is the second city of Mauritania, and the reason the railway exists, because a mine is worthless without a port. The ore arrives, is tipped, stockpiled, and loaded into bulk carriers bound for steelworks in Europe and Asia. Beside the terminal is Cansado, a company town built in the 1960s for the engineers and their families. And in the shallow water off the bay, for decades, ships were left to die. At the peak, there were more than 300 of them. Trawlers, freighters, tugs, refrigerated carriers, some from the other side of the world. The mechanism was not an accident. Scrapping a ship properly is expensive. Abandoning one in a poor country with a busy port and a thin regulatory system is cheap. Owners paid a fee to the right people, sailed the vessel in, and walked away. It became the largest ship graveyard on Earth, leaching fuel and heavy metals into a bay beside one of the richest fisheries in the world. The most photographed wreck was the United Malika, a refrigerated carrier that ran aground near Cap Blanc on the 4th of August, 2003. All 17 crew were taken off by the Mauritanian Navy. Salvage teams recovered the fuel and gave up on the hull. Most of the fleet has since been cut up. A European-funded operation removed many of the wrecks, and scrap crews took the rest, piece by piece, for the metal. So a country whose economy runs on exporting iron ore also spent 40 years importing other people's iron by accident, and then sold it back to itself. The men cutting the ships apart were doing the same work as the men at the mine. Different rock. Somewhere between here and the mountain, the timetable lists a stop called Choum. It is barely a place. A scatter of buildings on a plain, a water point, a few trucks waiting. The train pauses there for a matter of minutes, and everyone who is getting off for the interior gets off. Nobody on board will tell you why the line bends the way it does when it reaches that spur of rock. That answer is buried a few kilometers away, and it is one of the strangest things in this country. South of the port, the coast changes. The sand stops being scenery and becomes something else. mudflats, shallows, seagrass, islands that are barely islands. This is the Banc d'Arguer, 12,000 square kilometers of protected coast and one of the most productive pieces of ocean anywhere on the planet. The reason is wind. The trade winds run down this coast almost constantly, pushing the top layer of surface water away from the shore. Water has to come from somewhere to replace it, so cold water rises from the deep, and deep water is loaded with the nutrients that have been sinking out of the sunlit layer for centuries. Sunlight meets nutrients in shallow water. Plankton bloom. Everything else follows. The result is a nursery. Around 80% of the shrimp caught in Mauritanian waters spend their juvenile stage inside the park. Mullet, meager, rays, turtles, and more than 200 recorded species of fish, crustacean, and mollusk use it. The park alone is worth an estimated 78 million euros a year to the country's fisheries, and most of that value is created outside its boundaries by fish that were born inside them. Above the water, the numbers get harder to hold. More than 2 million birds winter on these mudflats, the largest concentration of wading birds on Earth. We will come back to them. Living among them in 7 small villages are the Imraguen. They are the only people permitted to fish inside the park, and only with sail, no engines, approved nets, fixed seasons. There are perhaps 500 to 600 of them left. In the 1970s, there were several thousand. Their name comes from a Berber word that means roughly the ones who gather life from the sea. They have been fishing this coast in essentially the same way since Portuguese ships first described them in the 15th century. When the yellow mullet run, between the end of October and January, the men wade out with nets across their shoulders and beat the surface of the water with sticks. The sound carries. Bottlenose dolphins come in toward it. The dolphins drive the mullet from the seaward side. The men close on them from the shore. Neither side has trained the other, and neither side is in charge. It is 2 predators using the same panic, and both of them eat. Older Imraguen say their grandfathers could whistle the dolphins in by name. The women take the catch. The fish is split, cleaned, and dried in the wind. The roe of the pregnant females is salted and pressed into botaga. The heads and organs are boiled down for an oil rich in vitamins that is traded inland. Nothing is discarded. In a place with no soil, no wood, and no water, waste is not a moral failure. It is a mathematical one. The seasons are shorter now. The catches are smaller, and the fish are smaller. Industrial fleets work the edge of the park and sometimes inside it. Foreign trawlers have been buying access to Mauritanian waters for decades, and plastic arrives on the tide from cities the Imraguen have never seen. Which raises something odd about this country. Mauritania sits beside one of the richest stretches of water in the world, and for most of its history, the people of the interior would not eat what came out of it. To a Moorish nomad, the sea was the edge of the world, and fish was food for people who had run out of options. Meat came from animals you owned. Status came from what you could move across land. Remember that when we get to the end of this journey. It explains a great deal about what has happened here in 60 years and how fast. Out on the headlands south of Nouadhibou, on a cliff called Cap Blanc, there is a beach almost nobody stands on. It belongs to the Mediterranean monk seal. There were once tens of thousands of them across the Mediterranean and the eastern Atlantic. Roman writers described them. Fishermen killed them for oil and skins, and then for competing. By the mid-20th century, they were among the rarest large mammals alive. In 1997, a die-off on this coast killed roughly 2/3 of the colony within weeks. Nobody is certain what caused it. A toxic algal bloom is the leading explanation. A virus is the other. They came back. There are now more than 350 animals at Cap Blanc, over half the world population of the species, on one stretch of Mauritanian cliff, in caves that can only be entered from the water. The females pup inside them. The whole recovery has rested on the fact that this coast is difficult to reach and almost never visited. A species survive here for the same reason the manuscripts we are going to see survive here, because it is hard to get to and because someone decided to leave it alone. "400 kilometers down the coast, that logic breaks. Nouakchott is the capital of Mauritania and the largest city in the country by an enormous margin. Roughly 1.6 million people, which is close to 1/3 of the entire population. In 1957, there was almost nothing here. A small settlement, a fort, a few hundred people on flat coastal sand. 1958, surveyors mark out a capital on that sand for a country that does not exist yet. The plan is for a modest administrative town. Ministries, housing, a port, and an eventual population of perhaps 8,000 people by 1970. It passes 8,000 within 5 years. Then the rain stops. The Sahelian drought of the late 1960s and 1970s was not an event. It was a decade of rainfall that did not come back. Wells fell, pasture failed, herds died. And in a pastoral society, a herd is not an asset. It is the institution. Savings, insurance, inheritance, marriage, standing, and the reason to keep moving. When the animals died, the reason to move died with them. In 1965, around 3/4 of Mauritanians were nomadic. By 1988, it was 12%. By 2000, under 6%. That is the fastest settling of a nomadic population recorded anywhere in the modern world. A way of living that had worked for roughly 2,000 years ended inside 25. The people who lost their herds went where the food aid and the work were. That meant Nouakchott. The city grew at close to 19% a year through the 1970s. There were no plans for that, and no land registry worth the name, because a nomadic society does not develop one. You do not title ground you intend to leave. So the arrivals built where they stood. Tents first, then wood, then scrap metal, then breeze block. Whole districts of the capital exist because a family put a tent down on empty sand in 1975 and never had a reason to lift it again. Today, Nouakchott is low sand-colored building under an enormous sky, threaded by roads that fill and empty with dust. Grand mosques, fish markets on the beach where hundreds of painted pirogues come in through the surf each evening. It is a functioning capital that was never designed to be one, on ground mostly lower than the sea beside it, in a country whose people largely did not want to live in cities at all. It is also, quietly, the largest single monument in Mauritania to a drought. "450 kilometers northeast of the capital, the ground stands up. The Adrar Plateau is a sandstone shelf that rises out of the flat country in cliffs and terraces, cut by dry valleys that fill perhaps once a decade. Attah sits at the foot of it. The road that climbs onto the plateau, the Imraguen Pass, was blasted and switchbacked by the French and is still the way most people go up. Inside one of those gorges is Turgid. You walk in between two walls of hot rock and the temperature drops. Water comes out of the base of the cliff, cold all year, in a country that has almost none. Date palms overhead, mats laid on the sand beneath them, the sound of moving water in a place where that sound is close to unheard of. It is the same geology that makes the plateau habitable. Rain falling on sandstone does not run off. It sinks, travels through the rock for years, and comes out lower down as a spring. The stone is a delay mechanism. It takes a rainfall that lasted an afternoon and releases it over a decade. Every oasis in this country is a version of that. Not a lake, a leak. In the shade at Turgid, someone will be making tea. It is less a drink here than a unit of time. Green tea, a great deal of sugar, a small pot on coals, poured from a height until it carries a head of foam. It comes 3 times, and the 3 glasses are said to run from bitter to sweet, the way a life is supposed to. Refusing the 3rd is close to an insult. Drinking it costs you an hour you had not planned on. That is the point. A society built on distance had to invent a reason to stay put. The other thing you may hear is the ardin, a harp with a calabash body played only by women in families that have carried the repertoire for generations. It accompanies Hassaniya poetry in a country where a good verse could once settle a dispute or ruin a man for life. This is one of the few places on earth where poetry is load-bearing rather than decorative. Out on the plateau, in the early morning, you may see a shape that is the wrong color for the ground. The Dorcas gazelle is small, pale, and built for a place with no water. It takes nearly everything it needs from what it eats and can go its whole life without drinking. When the heat becomes too much, it changes its behavior rather than its territory, feeding at dawn and dusk, lying up in shade between.
There used to be a great deal more of it.
Almost every large wild animal here has been reduced or removed. The scimitar-horned oryx is gone from Mauritania entirely. The Dama gazelle is critically endangered, and the last significant population of Dorcas gazelle in the country is not on the plateau at all. It is down on the mudflats of Banc d'Arguin, where the desert meets the sea and almost nobody goes. A desert animal survives by living next to the ocean. That sentence should not work. In this country, it keeps working. 90 kilometers east of Attah, over the top of the plateau, the road ends at a town that was here before almost anything else in this story. Chinguetti. It was founded in the 8th century, around the year 777, at a spring. The name is thought to come from a language nobody speaks anymore, and to mean something like the spring of the horses. It sat where the trans-Saharan routes crossed. Salt, gold, dates, and cloth moved through it. So did pilgrims, thousands of West Africans walking east toward Mecca, gathering here first, because a caravan is safer than a family. And the pilgrims came back. They came back carrying books. Chinguetti became a university without a campus. Men came to study Islamic law and stayed for astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and poetry. Teaching happened in courtyards and in tents. Its scholars were consulted from Morocco to Mali. At one point, there were said to be 30 libraries here. 13 survive. They hold something like 6,000 Arabic manuscripts, and every one of them is privately owned. They are not in a museum. They are in houses, rooms the size of a modest sitting room, with shelves and glass cases in buildings of dry stone and mud mortar under palm timber roofs. The same families have held them for generations, passing custody from father to son. Abdullah Habot has been custodian of his family's collection for 24 years. It holds more than 1,400 documents acquired over centuries from travelers who stopped here with nothing else to trade. Saif al-Islam al-Ahmed Mahmoud looks after around 700, handled in cotton gloves. The ink on some was made from charcoal and gum arabic. Some are on paper, some on parchment, some on sheepskin. Here is the contradiction that Chinguetti has been living inside for 1,200 years. Nothing that made these books came from here. There is no papermaking in the Sahara, no forests for gall ink, no bookbinding trade. Every sheet arrived on the back of an animal across 1,000 kilometers of desert because a scholar wanted it. And nothing has preserved these books better than the desert. Paper rots in humidity. It does not rot here. The air is so dry that manuscripts survive on open shelves in conditions that would destroy them in a European archive within a generation. The thing that made these books impossible is the same thing that made them last. And it is now the thing killing them. The 8th century core of Chinguetti is already gone. Not ruined, buried. Dunes moved across it and covered it, house by house, street by street. Walk the edges of the town and you find door frames at ankle height, roofs at knee height, rooms filled to the ceiling with sand that came in through a window. The Sahara has always moved. It is moving faster now. Sandstorms lay meters of dune across streets in a single season. Families abandon houses their grandparents built, move 100 meters out, and do it again. A town that once held many thousands has around 4,000 people left. There is a second problem, and it is the opposite one. Rain, when it comes now, comes wrong. Not a light season, but flash floods, water sheeting off bare rock into a town with no drainage and buildings made of mud mortar. Structures that survived a millennium of dryness are being taken apart by the handful of days a year when it is wet. There have been offers. The state has tried more than once to take the manuscripts into a national collection, where they could be catalogued, conserved, and climate-controlled. The families have refused. Their argument is not sentimental. Manuscripts removed from Chinguetti become an archive. Manuscripts kept in Chinguetti are the reason there is still a Chinguetti. Take them out, and you have preserved the paper and closed the town. One custodian put it as a question about whether a man should be asked to hand over his own hand or his own foot. So the doors stay shut to the state and open to anyone who walks up and asks politely. That arrangement has held a very long time, and nobody knows what happens to it when this generation of custodians is gone. There is one more thing that came out of Chinguetti, and it has never been explained. 1916, a French officer named Gaston Ripert is posted here, commanding the Camel Corps. He hears local men talking about something out in the dunes. He asks, a chief agrees to take him on condition that he brings no compass and does not watch the route. They ride out in the evening, southeast, most of the night. In the early morning, Ripert is shown a hill. He says it is iron, around 40 meters high and 100 long. He says it is not rusted and that its surface carries fine metal spines that bend rather than break when he tries to snap them. He takes a pick to it and comes away with a fragment weighing 4 kilograms. That fragment reached Paris and was confirmed as a mesosiderite, a stony iron meteorite and a rare one, real and from space, which meant the hill it came from would have been, by an enormous margin, the largest meteorite ever found on Earth. Nobody has ever found it again. Expeditions went out in the 1920s. The French army tried in the 1950s with a magnetic instrument. Théodore Monod, the greatest desert naturalist of his century, searched the Adrar for it on and off from 1934 into his 80s, offering rewards and questioning nomads for decades. One of them told him he could search until the end of the world and never find a man who knew of that rock. Monod concluded in 1989 that Ripert had been shown a sandstone hill in the dark and had believed what he was told. Ripert never withdrew a word of it. He wrote that he knew what people thought of him, that he was either a liar or a fool, and that he would do nothing to change their minds because he knew what he had seen. The locals call it Fer de Dieu, the iron of God. Hold on to that too. This is a country that is going to spend the next hour telling you about iron. 120 kilometers further east, at the edge of the dunes, is Ouadane. It was founded in 1147, and for 300 years it was one of the great caravan towns of the Western Sahara. The Portuguese ran a trading post here in the 15th century, the only one they ever established inland in this region. Then the routes moved, and Ouadane stopped. What is left is a stone town falling down a hillside. Roofless rooms, lanes of dry stone wall, a minaret standing alone. A few hundred people live in the new town beside it. Ouadane, Chinguetti, Tichit, and Oualata are listed together by UNESCO as the 4 ancient Xur. Tichit, in the center of the country, is the one closest to going. And 40 kilometers from Ouadane, on ground so flat it looks like nothing at all, is the strangest object in the country. You cannot really see it from the ground. You can drive across the middle of it and register only low ridges and a faint sense of curvature. From orbit, it is a target. Concentric rings, 40 kilometers across, in the middle of the Sahara. The Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara. When the first astronauts photographed it in the 1960s, they took it for an impact crater. It is not one. There is no shocked rock and no rim in the right place.
What it is
a dome. Layers of sedimentary rock pushed up from below by magma that never reached the surface, then eroded flat over hundreds of millions of years. Cut a dome flat, and its layers show as circles, youngest outside, oldest at the center. The soft layers wore away. The hard quartzite layers did not, and now stand as the rings. A constant northeasterly wind keeps the whole thing swept clear of sand, so the pattern stays legible from orbit. It is a cross-section of 600 million years, and it can only be read from somewhere none of the people living beside it have ever been. Which brings us back to the railway, and to the one thing on this line that nobody can defend. Around 460 kilometers inland from Nouadhibou, the track approaches a ridge near Choum. In the early 1960s, when the line was surveyed, the country did not exist yet as an independent state. The easiest route ran, for a few kilometers, through territory administered by Spain. So the French asked. The Spanish set terms. The terms were judged unacceptable, and nobody wanted to pay them. So, rather than buy a right-of-way across a few kilometers of empty desert, French engineers drove a tunnel 2 kilometers long through solid granite so that the railway would not have to leave French-controlled ground. They built it, it worked. Trains ran through it for nearly 30 years. One geographer later called it a monument to European stupidity in Africa, and the phrase has stuck because nothing better has been offered. There is a detail that makes it worse. In 1975 and 1976, Spain left Western Sahara, and Mauritania briefly administered the very ground the tunnel had been dug to avoid. For a short period, the country owned both the tunnel and the reason it existed. And in 1991, the railway gave up on the argument. A 14-kilometer diversion was laid around the ridge, and the tunnel was closed, which means that today, for about 5 kilometers, the National Railway of Mauritania is not in Mauritania. The track crosses into the Polisario-controlled zone of Western Sahara, runs through it, and comes back. The train does not stop. There is no border post. There is nothing out there to have a border post for. Everyone on top of the ore leaves the country in the dark and returns to it, and almost none of them know it happened. The tunnel is still there, a few kilometers off the line. 2 kilometers of hand-cut granite in a mountain leading nowhere, dug so that a border on a European map would not have to be discussed. "600 kilometers to the south, the country changes completely. The Senegal River runs along the southern border, and beside it is the only part of Mauritania that is properly green. Rice paddies, cattle, acacia. Rain that arrives every year rather than every decade. This is where the Halpula, the Soninke, and the Wolof have farmed and fished for centuries. Rosso on the river is the crossing to Senegal and one of the busiest places in the country. Inland is Kaidi and the irrigated schemes that grow most of what Mauritania actually eats. It is also the fault line. Mauritania is not one society. It is at least 3 sharing a flag. The Bidan, the Arabic-speaking Moors, who have held political and economic power since independence. The Haratin, Moors of black African descent who speak the same language, share the same religion, and descend from people who were enslaved. And the Afro-Mauritanian communities of the river who are neither. In April 1989, a dispute between herders and farmers on the river escalated into killings in both Mauritania and Senegal. What followed in Mauritania was not a riot. It was a policy. Tens of thousands of Afro-Mauritanians were stripped of their identity documents and expelled across the river. Their land was reallocated. Hundreds of black Mauritanian soldiers were killed in custody between 1990 and 1991. Some of those expelled came back in the 2000s. Many did not, and many who did have never recovered title to the ground they farmed. And beneath that sits the older thing. Mauritania abolished slavery in 1981. It was the last country on earth to do so. It did not make owning a person a crime until 2007. It did not specifically criminalize hereditary slavery, the version where status passes from mother to child, until 2015.
There have been very few prosecutions.
Estimates of how many people remain in some condition of slavery vary enormously, from the tens of thousands to figures far higher, and the government's position has generally been that the problem no longer exists. Biramda Abeid's grandmother died a slave. His father's wife and 2 of his children were sold in front of him. Abeid founded an abolitionist movement, was awarded a United Nations Human Rights Prize in 2013, has been arrested and imprisoned repeatedly, and has twice run for president of the country. He is a devout Muslim who argues that what is being defended here is not religion, but property. His organization has spent years being refused legal recognition. There is no resolution to offer here. It is not a story with a recovery in it yet. It is simply a fact about the country the train runs through. And it is one of the reasons the Haratin districts of Nouakchott and the mining camps of the north are full of people whose families had nothing to inherit. At the far eastern edge of the country, 900 kilometers from the coast, there is a town almost nobody reaches. Oualata was the southern end of the caravan road from Sidi El Massa, and for a while, the main trading city of the region before Timbuktu took that role. It has manuscripts too, and a road that was only paved recently. What Oualata is known for is its walls. The houses are red earth, and around every doorway and window, the women paint white designs, looping, symmetrical, drawn freehand, repainted whenever the rain takes them. The patterns pass mother to daughter, and they mark the threshold between the family and the desert. In a place with no timber, no carving tradition, and no pigment beyond what the ground gives up, people looked at a blank mud wall and decided it was unacceptable for it to stay blank. That instinct is the whole country. Poetry instead of monuments, manuscripts instead of cathedrals, a pattern around a doorway at the end of the last road. None of it lasts. All of it is redone. North of everything, out in the emptiest quarter of the country, there is an animal almost nobody has seen alive. The addax is a heavy, pale antelope with spiraled horns, and one of the most extreme desert survivors on Earth. Its coat turns nearly white in summer to throw off heat. Its hooves are broad and flat, so it can cross soft sand where a hard-footed animal would sink. And it does not drink. Not occasionally, at all. It takes what it needs from the moisture inside desert grasses and from dew on the plants before dawn. It moves at night. It can smell rain at a distance and walk toward it for days across ground with nothing on it. There may be fewer than 100 left in the wild across the entire Sahara. It was not the desert that did it. The addax survived the desert for hundreds of thousands of years. What it could not survive was a vehicle with a rifle in it, on open ground with no cover, at 100 kilometers an hour. An animal that solved thirst and heat and hunger and distance was undone by the fact that people could finally get out there, which is, in its way, the story of everything the railway did to this country. The line ends at Zouarat. Around 45,000 people live here, in the far north, in the region of Tiris Zemmour. It is the largest town for hundreds of kilometers in any direction, and it exists for exactly one reason. Behind it stands Kediet A Gil. 915 meters, the highest ground in Mauritania, and dark. Not shadowed, dark with a bluish cast, because a great part of its mass is magnetite. Magnetite is iron oxide, and it is naturally magnetic. That is why compasses fail here. The rock generates a field strong enough to pull a needle off north. Surveyors working the region in the 1950s and 1960s learned to distrust their instruments, and then learned to use the failure. If your compass went wrong, there was ore underneath you. Several of the deposits that keep this railway running were found by noticing where the magnetism was lying. A mountain that breaks navigation became the reason a country could be navigated at all. People have been taking iron out of this mountain since at least the 11th century in small amounts by hand. 1952. Surveyors confirm what the ground has been suggesting. The deposits here are not a curiosity. They are among the richest in the world. Concessions go to a consortium of European mining companies. Construction begins on a railway that has to cross 700 kilometers of desert with no water, no towns, and no labor force, to a port that does not exist yet either. The first loaded train pulls away from the sidings and starts west. In 1974, the mining company is nationalized. It becomes SNIM, and it has been the largest employer in Mauritania and the biggest single source of foreign currency ever since. The town grew around it. A clinic, a school, a cinema, a swimming pool. The standard apparatus of a company town dropped into the Sahara because engineers had to be persuaded to live there. The best ore went first. That is always what happens. The original mines took hematite, rich enough to be crushed, sized, and shipped as it comes out of the ground. Tazadit alone held something like 200 million tons of it. What is left in quantity is magnetite in the dark hills called Gelbs, Gelb el Rhine, found in 1981, and Gelb Mahoudat in 1990. Magnetite is leaner. It cannot simply be loaded. It has to be crushed fine, run past magnets that pull the iron out and leave the waste rock behind, then reassembled into concentrate, which is this country's whole history in one process. What was easy is finished. What is left needs more machinery, more electricity, and more of everything to produce the same result. 14 million tons still go down that line every year, and it still funds something close to a fifth of the state. Late in the afternoon, the loading is done. The wagons stand in the yard under Kediet A. Gil, heaped with rock. 4 locomotives at the head, sometimes more spaced down the length of it, because a train this heavy cannot be pulled from one end alone. The couplings would not hold, and the slack running through 3 kilometers of steel would tear it apart on the first grade. People begin to arrive along the track. They come up the embankment with bags, water, blankets, plastic sheeting, sometimes a goat, and walk the length of the train looking for a wagon they like. A loaded wagon is better than an empty one because on top of the ore, you are up in the air, out of the dust that pools in the bottom of an empty box. They throw the bags up, climb the ladder on the outside, and drop down onto the rock to make a place to sit, flattening a hollow in the ore, laying a mat, stacking bags into a windbreak. Nobody checks a ticket, nobody counts them, nobody in any formal sense knows they are there. Then the train starts, and it takes a long time to finish starting. What happens over the next 20 hours is the reason this railway is known outside Mauritania at all. The first thing is the sound. 3 kilometers of couplings taking up slack, one after another, running down the train like something enormous clearing its throat. Then the wagons begin to move at walking pace, and Zuarat slides backwards, and the mountain with it. The train does not go fast. It does not need to. It averages something under 50 kilometers an hour, and it stops without explanation, sometimes for an hour, because this is a single track and something is coming the other way. Late afternoon on the ore is brutal. The rock has been in the sun all day, and it radiates heat upward into you. The wind comes over the front of the wagon carrying iron dust, and the dust gets into everything. Clothes, food, water, eyes, the inside of your mouth. Within an hour, everyone on board is the same color. Then the sun goes down, and the problem inverts. Sand and rock hold almost no heat overnight. The temperature falls 20–25 degrees. The wind that was hot is now cold and still moving at the speed of the train. People pull blankets over their heads and lie down in the hollows they made, side by side, and the ore holds the shape. Above them, there is nothing between the desert and the sky. No towns, no lights, no aircraft. The stars in that part of the Sahara are the kind that people who grew up under streetlights do not entirely believe in. Somewhere in the middle of that night, the train leaves the country. 5 kilometers of track run through the Polisario-controlled zone of Western Sahara on the diversion built in 1991 around the ridge at Choum. There is no post, no barrier, no sign. The desert on that side looks exactly like the desert on this side, because it is.
Then the line comes back across.
And stays back. Nobody on top of the oar stirs. They have crossed an international boundary twice, in the dark, asleep, on a pile of rock, and it has made no difference to anything. Around dawn, the train pulls into Choum and pauses, and the interior empties out. This is where you get off for Attar, for the plateau, for Chinguetti. Pickups are waiting on the sand. There is a rush of bags coming down the ladders, shouted arrangements, tea being poured beside a truck, and then the train starts again with half the people it had. The rest have another 12 hours in front of them. And that day is the emptiest part of the journey. West of Choum, there is very little. Gravel plain, low rock, dune fields that come up to the track and get pushed back by a machine every few weeks. The line runs almost parallel to the northern border for hundreds of kilometers, through country that has no reason to be entered by anybody. You can stand up on a moving wagon and see the whole train ahead of you and behind you, curving, the locomotives so far forward they are a separate event. Now the question from the beginning of all this can be answered properly. Why does a man ride 700 kilometers on top of iron ore, in the cold, covered in dust, when he could have taken a bus? Part of it is money, and part of it is that the road is worse than it sounds. But the real answer is the one underneath. 60 years ago, 3/4 of this country was nomadic. Movement was not a hardship. It was a competence, the thing families were good at, the thing that made you somebody. You knew where the water was, you knew what the sky meant, and you moved. Then the rain failed, and the herds died, and almost all of that stopped in one generation. The camels went, the roots went, the knowledge stopped being useful. What did not go was the assumption that a person moves. The ore train is not a stunt, and it is not a hardship posting. It is the last working caravan in the Western Sahara. It goes when it goes, it costs nothing, it carries goods and animals and families and news. It crosses country nobody else crosses, and everyone on it is asleep in the open air under the same stars their grandparents slept under. The camel has been replaced by 22,000 tons of iron. Everything else about it is the same. In the last hours, the air changes. It becomes damp. There is salt in it. The land drops away and grays out, and off to the left, there is a flat, pale shine that has not been there for 700 kilometers. The Atlantic. The train comes down into Nouadhibou through the ore terminal at Cansado, past stockpiles and conveyors and cranes, and stops. People come down the ladders stiff, black with dust, holding out arms to take bags. They walk off along the track and out through the gate into the town, and behind them, the wagons are already being rotated and emptied, one at a time, the ore going onto belts and into the holds of ships that will take it to a furnace on another continent. Then the locomotives run round, and the same train goes back the other way, empty that evening, and people climb into the empty wagons and ride east. In October, on the mudflats at Iwik, the birds start arriving. Godwits and knots and curlews that left the Arctic weeks earlier come down onto the Banc d'Arguin in numbers that are difficult to photograph honestly. 2 million of them on the same shoals their species has used for as long as anyone has been able to check. A bar-tailed godwit weighs about as much as a bar of soap, and it has flown from Siberia. It arrives with its flight muscles wasted and its stomach partly reabsorbed, because carrying a digestive system across a continent is a waste of fuel. It rebuilds both in the mud within a fortnight, and in spring it does the whole thing in reverse. They do not come here because it is beautiful. They come because the trade winds have pulled cold water up off this coast for millions of years, and the mud that makes holds more food than anywhere else on the route. The birds worked that out long before anyone drew Mauritania on a map. There is a fragment of iron in a museum drawer in Paris weighing just over 4 kilograms. It is genuine. It fell from space. Gaston Ripert died in 1957 without taking back a word of his account, and Theodore Monod searched the dunes for the rest of it for 55 years and found nothing. Chemical analysis later suggested the parent body was small, nothing like a hill, which should settle it, and somehow has not. Papers are still being written. People still go out and look. A country whose entire modern existence rests on iron carries in its own folklore an iron mountain nobody has ever been able to find. And the sea, the moors of the interior once considered beneath them, now feeds them. Fish is close to a quarter of what Mauritania exports. The pirogues come in through the surf at Nouakchott every evening, and the men hauling them up the sand are in many cases 2 generations from families who owned camels and would not have touched it. The money is shifting again. In January 2025, the first gas came out of a field offshore, shared with Senegal, in water almost 3,000 meters deep, and the first cargoes shipped that April. The railway is being rebuilt too, a package worth around $275 million signed in 2025 to renew the track, extend it, and buy new locomotives and wagons. Which raises a question nobody here has an answer for. If the line is modernized properly, new stock, tighter operations, real security around a moving industrial asset, does anyone still get to climb the ladder? Nobody has said it will stop. Nobody has said it will continue. And in Chinguetti, the sand is still moving. The 8th century quarter is already underneath it. Trees have been planted along the approaches, and some have taken. The 13 libraries are still in private houses, on open shelves, in a town of 4,000 people that once held many times that. Abdullah Habot has had the family collection for 24 years. The custody has always passed down, and it has always worked, and there has never been a plan for what happens if one day it does not. So this is where it sits. A country twice the size of France, held together by a single line of steel that was laid to serve a mine and ended up serving everything else. A people who spent 2,000 years crossing this desert on animals and now cross it on a cargo train for nothing, because moving is the one inheritance the drought could not take. Nobody knows how long the ore lasts, or the libraries, or whether the men guarding them will have sons who want to. Nobody knows whether the sand stops at the edge of Chinguetti or goes through it. And every evening, in a yard beneath a mountain that breaks compasses, the wagons are loaded and people walk up the embankment with their bags and look for a good place to sit. Thank you for traveling this one with us. If you would like more journeys like this, subscribe, and we will see you on the next.